For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. That's how our parable starts, often called the parable of the workers in the vineyard. So, hi, thanks for joining me for another parable, number 6, as I believe. And this one is dense. And what I mean by that is as we go through this, there is just one application after another. Some are quite big and awfully important. Others are a lot smaller, but there's just a lot there. I was thinking as I was working on this that with these notes I have now, I may not ever have to think again of an idea about how to preach this parable. There's just so much in it. So, as we always do, let's start by beginning with prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So, Father, we pause, in my case, at the end of a rather long day, but we pause to ask your blessings on us as we open up your word, that as always, you would open our hearts, maybe soften our hearts, so that the message that we hear, especially those messages, those lessons that make us uncomfortable, that those lessons would sink deep and help us to draw closer to you. So be with us, be with our conversation now, and we ask this in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So again, as we always do, you need to read this parable. It is only found in Matthew. You'll find it in Matthew chapter 20, right at the beginning, verse 1. You want to go, the story ends in verse 15, but Matthew adds a bit of a tagline in verse 16. So you need to pause the video and read the story, Matthew 20, 1 to 16. And now that you're back, maybe read it twice, perhaps. There's kind of a lot in it. You may have noticed the parable is in two parts. For verses 1 to 7 is all the story about when the owner of the vineyard hires all these workers. And then 8 to 15 talks about when they all get paid. And it's kind of important to keep that in mind. You know, it seems like the lesson is in the back end when he pays the workers, but we don't want to neglect the first part. And certainly the theme of fairness just seems to jump out at most people. Perhaps you are like that. You just read this parable and somehow the words in your head, "That's not fair," just seems to hit you hard. And that's a valid thing, and we'll talk about it. But please let me encourage you not to get sidetracked by that. There are other things in here beyond fairness, as important as that is. So let's go through our 4 tools. If by chance you are listening to this video and when I say 4 tools, it doesn't mean anything to you, could I encourage you to go back to the very first video in this series? We're just looking at we have 4 different ways to look at parables, and those are the tools that we'll be using. The first one today, I'm actually going to sort of skip, and that is this idea of looking at details in the parable. As you'll see, it just makes more sense to me in explaining this if we just work the details, if you will, into the other 3 tools. That just made it easier for me to organize the material. But you certainly could just go through and just start looking for sort of oddities. I mean, isn't it odd that the owner gives a precise wage to the very first group, but he doesn't give a precise wage to the others? It's not what you'd expect necessarily from an owner, trying to hire people. It's not even what you'd expect from workers. Like, shouldn't you tell me what you're gonna pay me so I know what to expect? Little details like that, they'll all come up as we discuss this, or I hope a lot of them, but you could just pause the video if you want to and go see what details jump out at you. So let's go to our second tool, Allegory. Now, I would point out to you right at the very beginning, Jesus starts off, the kingdom of heaven is like, and you could say the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner, but he's not saying God is like a landowner. So there's a little bit here that, it's almost like Jesus is pointing us away from analogy. But still, as I have pointed out before, despite the fact that allegory is not my favorite, there's always something to it. And in this case, a bunch of them. So if you are kind of common, I guess, or you've been around church for a while, you may have looked at this in an allegorical way. Like just one example that I have here in my notes, the landowner is God, and the marketplace is the world. The church is the vineyard. So the workers are going from the world into the vineyard. The manager is Jesus. Workers are those that become disciples. They're us, but they become disciples at different times in their lives. The settling of the accounts, that's the last judgment, and their payment is, sort of equal, or their eternal reward, I should say. And certainly looked at that, you can get a lot out of that, especially as it relates to the last judgment. And if you allow me, I'm going to save some of that discussion for a little bit later, but that's valid. A second possibility is the New International Bible Commentary suggests that Matthew might have looked at this in terms of Jews and Gentiles, that the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, they came first into the kingdom. They were the first, workers hired. And it was the Gentiles that came later. And they think that maybe Matthew is trying to put a spin on it so that the Jewish Christians, if you will, those like the apostles who were Jewish and then became the apostles of Jesus, would treat the Gentiles equally. That it wouldn't be one of those issues where, the Jewish Christians would look at the Gentiles and say, wait, you haven't been Jewish all your life, you've come late, and there's, they would have brought up this sort of fairness issue. It's not right. You need to do what we had to do, sort of things along those lines. That's a fair point. Some of you know your Bible well enough to know that in the book of Acts, this idea of admitting the Gentiles into the church on an equal basis was not without controversy. Third possibility is raised by some Old Testament imagery. The vineyard is often used as a symbol for Israel in the Old Testament. So the prophets bring this up. And the idea of the harvest as judgment, that also is common in the Old Testament. And so looked at it that way, it's sort of an allegory. The vineyard represents Israel, the payment, the harvest is judgment. Then there again, you get another just allegory that points you to the idea of, well, what happens at the judgment, so to speak. And so all that's interesting. But if you think about it, all those analogies where they sort of point you is to this whole issue of everybody gets the same wage, which brings us back to that whole fairness issue that jumped into our heads right at the beginning. So again, we'll get to it, but that's worth considering. As a matter of fact, you might at this point just want to pause this video and give it your own thoughts at this point. Take it to prayer, especially if the fairness thing bothers you. If it seems, I don't know about this. And so before we get in a little deeper and see some other things, maybe it's worth pausing now and saying, okay, let me just pray through the analogies. Probably the first one is the easiest, thinking of it all in terms of Christian terms and the judgment. Maybe that's worth doing. And if you want to pause, I always need some coffee. I'll be happy to wait. The third tool we often use is trying to listen to these stories through the ears of a first century Jew. And in this case, I think it's good because it'll provide us a lot of background. Jesus always seems to use settings that are familiar to his audience. And so this story, in many respects, I think would have just made perfect sense. May sound a little odd to us. For example, this idea of day workers. We're not used to this. We picture people having a job. You have a job, you go to work day after day after day. But in this day and age, this was not uncommon. People would just go to the marketplace, and it was sort of a labor market, if you will. You brought your tools with you, and then you waited, and people would come by to hire you. This, by the way, is still done in parts of the world today. And if someone hired you, you got paid. And if someone did not hire you, you're out of money. The thing that's, I think, important, especially as you consider the behavior of all the characters, a day's wage, this denarii, is not a lot of money. It's sort of, if you will, you're just getting by. We might think of it as paycheck to paycheck. And as a matter of fact, the owner, the employer, through Torah, through the Jewish law, was obligated to pay the laborers every day. It wasn't like you worked a couple of days and then came back a week later and got your pay. And the reason that seemed to be the case was they needed the money every day. They didn't have, like, you and I might have $20 in our wallet, and so we're fine for a day till we get paid. They did not have that. So let's see. The fact that this would have been familiar to the Jewish audience also means that they would have picked up a little easier than we do, perhaps, some oddities in the behavior of these people. First, it's the landowner that is hiring people. That makes sense to us, but in that day and age, the landowner more than likely would have had a manager. And it would have been the manager that would have gone in the morning to the marketplace and hired the people he needed for the day. And then he would have, supervised their labor, told them what to do, and then paid them. The landowner might not have been involved in any part of the day's work or pay. And so the fact that the landowner is even here would have, perhaps to a Jewish audience of that day, gone like, well, that's interesting that the landowner is doing this. It also would have been interesting that the landowner makes repeated trips. You would think that it'd be more efficient, and certainly you would have some sense of how much labor you need. You would have thought the guy would have gone in and hired everybody right away and sent them all out for the full day. And so it would have been a little question in their minds, like, why is this guy going back? They might think, for example, well, the guy doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know how much labor he needs. One commentary suggested that a scenario that fits these circumstances would have been harvest time. And maybe the landowner thought he had more time to bring in the harvest, the grapes, but maybe it threatened rain, and rain is awful in that situation. And so maybe he sort of, if you will, panicked. I need to get this harvest in by the end of the day. And so he just kept going back to find people. Something else they might have noticed is that, there's no explanation of why these other laborers did not get hired earlier, especially when the last one, their answer is, no one hired us. That seems to imply that they've been there all day. And there again, if the explanation was, well, this guy's desperate for labor, he would have seen them and would have hired them. So again, maybe it's not critical, maybe it's not really important, but it's just odd. It would have, as they would have heard this story, all these kind of sort of questions would have been floating through their mind. If nothing else, they're going to think that this owner, there's something different about him. In other words, if I have a stereotype in my mind of owners, vineyard owners, Jesus, by these oddities, is sort of knocking that out of their head. And the fact that the wages for the later hires is not clearly defined, as I mentioned before, that even sounds odd to us. As a laborer, you might have said, well, what are you going to pay me? Like I may want to go with someone else. But at the same time, maybe they just kind of knew this is the only job I'm going to get today, no matter, so it doesn't matter. If he promised me he'll give me what's right, what's just, I'll just have to trust him. So maybe there's an element of trust in this. The other thing, well, you and I sort of, and I hope I'm speaking for you, maybe you're different than so many. But, we tend to just jump on the fairness thing. That seems to, hit us in the face. A commentator suggested that for a Jewish audience, it might have been the landowner's generosity. That might have been the thing that jumped out to them. Jesus typically talked to poorer audiences, and so they're likely to identify with the workers and would have known about this is, I need this money. If I don't get a job today, I'm going to go hungry. My family is going to go hungry. I need a job. And the fact that this landowner was so generous to everyone, maybe that would have been the thing that just caught them, that surprised them, that shocked them. And as, one of my commentators, my go-to commentators, she always, about parables at least, she always said that if you can't find something shocking about the parable, maybe you missed something, and maybe that was the issue. All right. I might add, by the way, the fact that they needed the job so much, maybe that's why they're willing to go into the field without knowing. All righty. And so that's kind of a bit about how a Jewish audience might have looked at it. Not talking about their interpretation of it, but just how they would have heard it. And then let's go to the fourth tool. Focus on a character in the story. I think this is where, you really start to dig in a little bit. So take them one at a time. You could start with the first workers hired. So what's going on with them? What's, from their point of view? Well, at the beginning of the story, they are perfectly happy. They've got a job, and they got a job at a just wage. They agreed to a denarii a day. That was what they would have expected. It's not generous. He's not cheating them. They would have thought this is normal. And certainly starting first thing in the morning, that would have been normal too. So as far as they're concerned, this whole day is just a day of work, a normal day. And even when they line up to get paid, okay, we're all going to get paid. Everything is fine until they get to the end. And that's where the surprise comes for them. They would have been like, what? What's going on? Because they would have probably been, I would think, been surprised that the guy gave a full day's wage for the 1 hour work that the last group did. But maybe at that point, they would have said, hey, this is a nice guy, a nice boss. What I want to do here is I want to keep working for this guy, because clearly if he's giving them a full denarii for 1 hour's work, I'm gonna get a bunch of money out of this. So they might at that point have thought, this is a great guy. But then, what do? It gets to, they realize what they perceive to be the unfairness of it all, and everything changes. It was a horrible day at work. I worked for this guy who's completely unreasonable. How quick it changes. I think it's also interesting that, when they complain, it's in verse 12. These last men have worked only 1 hour. That's how that statement starts. There's no title in it. They're not showing the landowner any respect at that point. And as we'll see in a moment, when the landowner responds, he refers to them as friend. And I think it's an interesting note. They're not treating him very well. He's trying to do his best to them. There is, of course, in verse 15, the landowner brings up the point of jealousy. And that may be a really good way to describe the reaction of these workers. These first workers hired, they're jealous. These guys got more than they should have, and I am envious of them. I wish I had only worked 1 hour and then gotten a full day's wage. We'll bring this up in a few moments, but there is this issue of comparison. Jealousy starts with comparison. That's where it all begins. You cannot be jealous unless you are comparing your situation, your home, your car, your talents, your looks, whatever it is. Your situation has to be compared to somebody else's for you to be jealous of them, because you have to have something to look at. If you just look at someone's beautiful car and you never knew what a car was, for example, well, you'd be thrilled. You hope, anyway. So it is interesting, this idea of how they view the landowner. But I should point out, it's not necessarily true that they all viewed the guy this way, because it's entirely possible that they too would have said, especially early on, this guy is generous. And I wonder if they could have stayed there, if they would have at that moment said, this is a generous landowner, and even maybe a little disappointment at getting less than they thought. They just would have realized, no, I'm getting what I was expecting. This guy is generous to these other people. Maybe I still want to work for him. So that's possible. We don't want to lump everybody all together. By the way, not a bad idea to pause right now, because a lot of us, if we were going to identify with the character in the story, it might have been these workers. So maybe you want to pause, give it a little thought. Is this me? Am I quick to compare? Am I quick to be jealous? Am I quick to change my assessments of a situation like these guys do, or seem to? Yeah, stop for a moment. What about the other workers? The guy is hired at the 3rd, 6th, 9th hour. By the way, those phrases, that starts at 6 a.m. So these other workers would have been hired at 9, noon, 3, and then 2 hours later at 5. That's the way that would have worked out. What about them? Well, again, you say, well, okay, so they get there to the marketplace probably first thing in the morning because you want to get a job, and no one hires them right away. So now maybe they're just a little anxious. What if I don't get any job? What if I don't get any money today? There are consequences to that. So maybe that's how they start out. And then this guy comes and hires them. And of course, as the day goes on, each set of these workers, well, they might be more and more anxious. I mean, imagine getting there at 6 a.m. Nobody hires you, and you're still there at 12 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon. No one hires you. Maybe you're not working, but maybe your anxiety level is seriously going up. Brings up the whole issue of worry. Maybe that's one way by which you can identify with these workers. Maybe they were worried, and maybe you worry. The other thing, of course, is this bargain that they make. He doesn't tell them what he's going to pay them. He says, I'll pay you what is right, or a lot of translations will say, I'll pay you what is just. There's trust in that. Now, again, like I said, maybe it is a question of, I don't have any other options, so even if this guy cheats me, at least I'll get something. So maybe that's possible. But maybe, somehow, they sense that this guy, okay, I want to trust this guy. In some way, I'm judging him to be trustworthy, that he will give me what is just. And then, what about them? They're in, the end of the parable seems to focus on the first and the last workers, but what about the guys in the middle? So they see that the last workers hired get the full day's wage. Well, what about the guys at 3 o'clock? What do you think they're thinking? Okay, well, they worked 1 hour, I worked 3. Maybe they're not thinking they're going to get 3 days' wages. Maybe that seems even excessive to them, but maybe they're thinking they're going to get, a day's wage and a tip. That's possible. So could they have been disappointed? Or just because, they, especially after they got paid and they realized they had gotten a great deal out of the landowner, he'd been generous to them, maybe they don't compare. Like, we've both been given generosity. And so even if, well, yeah, technically you got more generosity than I did, but it doesn't matter. I just wonder if that might have been the case, that it's not until you get to the first workers where you really suddenly get enough of a comparison where it blows up, so to speak. Maybe the workers hired second at 9 a.m., maybe they are feeling a little odd about how this is all going down. But even they got a good deal. Maybe they don't think it was as good a deal as people had hired later, but still. I think there's a lot to that. So then, what about the last workers? By the way, you could pause the video here too. Think about those middle workers, if you will. But what about the last workers? So as we talked about, by the time they got hired, it's 5 in the afternoon. I mean, I just wonder if I would have given up and gone home. If no one hires you by mid-afternoon, who's going to hire you for an hour or, an hour or two? And so it's kind of interesting. There's something to that, I think. These guys, they're, they got some faith, they got some hope, or they're desperate, or, maybe, they didn't give up. Maybe there's perseverance there. That's interesting. I don't know. Maybe that you see that in yourself, and maybe that's how you can identify with them. It is, of course, interesting to think what they would have expected for their pay. And you're going to get paid first. So they got no hints. So you figure they might have thought, well, I guess I worked 1/12 of the day. I'll get paid 1/12 of the wage. Maybe they thought that way. But they had to have been like amazingly surprised at their pay. I mean, like seriously ecstatic. It would have been this moment. I mean, when they got home, you can imagine, calling the family together or neighbors or anybody. It was like, look what happened. I was so nervous. I was afraid I wasn't going to get paid, for any work. I wasn't going to get a job. And suddenly I get this 1 hour job and the guy gives me a full day's wage. I mean, this is a tremendous story. This is a story that sticks in your mind. You tell the kids, you tell the grandkids, that the day that I got hired by this amazing guy. I think there's something in that for us. I also wonder what it does for them. In other words, they have just seen an amazing act of generosity. I wonder if it makes them generous. I wonder if it serves as an example, a role model to them. Wow, I'll never be rich like the landowner or the vineyard owner. I'll never do that. But wonder if they're inspired in some way to say, well, how can I be generous? That's, I think, a great thought, a great application. And you also have to wonder what they do the next day. You could think they're going like, wow, I know there's more work to do in that vineyard, and so that guy's going to come looking for people again. Maybe I will get to the vineyard or the marketplace late so that I get hired later, and so I get another full day's pay for not a full day's work. You wonder if they thought that, if they thought they could sort of manipulate this new system that had come up. Because we don't know. Maybe it was a one-day thing. And then you even wonder, what happens if it does? What happens if it repeats the next day? And one of these guys is hired last 2 days in a row. And the second time, the landowner pays them 1/12 of a day's work. Do they change their mind about the landowner? That cheapskate, something like that. Interesting thought. What about the landowner? It's interesting to consider his motives in all this. He's not acting, shall we say, in a standard, normal way. And so you just kind of wonder what's going on with him. In other words, does he start the day out with the idea, I want to be generous and I intend to be generous? Or is it a question just the way things happen to unfold in whatever way it happened out at the Vineyard? He suddenly at the end of the day finds himself, I got an opportunity here. I could be really generous to these last workers. And so you wonder if he seized a moment or if he planned it out. He certainly seems like a kind guy. The fact that he's the one out there hiring the laborers means he's comfortable talking to them. He's comfortable dealing with them. He's not, I'm the landowner, I'm the boss, I got the corner office, you don't talk to me, you talk to the manager kind of thing. So there is certainly that. It also might be that he understands the needs of day laborers. He's got the means to help them, and, this is a way to help them. So maybe there's that kindness and sympathy in this guy. Again, I pointed out to you before, in verse 13, he addresses even the disgruntled guys as friend. He talks to one of them, it appears, and he says, friend, and tries to explain himself to them. There's no doubt this guy is generous, and that's certainly a good role model for us. I think it's also important to notice that he is just. Justice, the term just and justice, refers to giving somebody what is their due. And if you look closely at this parable, that is exactly what he does. He is a just man. At the beginning, he clearly says to these first workers, I will pay you a denarii for the day's for a day's work. That's the contract. And so justice demands that he gives them what he has promised them, and he does. He has not cheated them in any way, shape, or form. That's the point he makes to the workers in verse 13. And he certainly is just to the other workers, because none of them really can claim more, than none of them can claim a full day's wage because they did not work a full day. And so he's certainly just to them. He has given them what is their due. He just has also chosen to give to them some extra. And it's not even equal gifts. To the people that are hired out at 9 o'clock, in essence, he gives them a gift of 3 hours worth of wages. To the people hired at 5 o'clock, he gives them the gift of 11 hours worth of wages. I don't know. What do you think about someone giving different gifts to different people? I know that may not sit well with you. I grew up in a household of fairness. I don't know if my brothers and I, if this was us or this was my dad, but I do know every year at Christmas, my father tallied up the value of all the Christmas presents and made sure that they were remarkably close. I mean, probably down to a dollar, because I know my dad would occasionally put a small toy or something in our stockings because one of the three of us was short a couple dollars versus the other ones. I don't know that mattered to us. We knew what was going on, and maybe because we sort of knew about it, maybe we would have been disappointed if that had not been the case one Christmas. But you'd like to think that you're not keeping score like that. You'd like to think that you could look at somebody and say, wow, they gave me a gift. And the fact that they give somebody else a bigger gift wouldn't make any difference. But it's a good question for us. Does it? Because if it does bother us, maybe that's something we need to take to prayer. Maybe it's an opportunity of growth. And of course, the whole issue of fairness, he's not fair. Not the way we normally define it. He's not being fair at all. Fairness would suggest that you pay everybody, you would think of it in terms of an hourly wage, and you'd pay everybody as much as they work. That's sort of the way we think of fairness. And that gets us way back to the beginning of this video when we're looking at this and going like, this guy's not fair. He's not. I mean, he's just not. There's no way to put a polite spin on it. Before we get to the last part of this, which is this issue of fairness and some other applications, it might be worth pausing the video. I might say that too, because I can see the time going by. This has been a longer video than all the rest. It's just because there's so much in it. So maybe you need a break. Why don't you stop and figure out which character you are in this story? Pray about that. My throat needs a little liquid. All right, so what about fairness? Well, it's just uncomfortable, right? Isn't it? I mean, we read this story and it's like, this isn't right. It's not right. And even if in the back of our mind we get the generosity of the guy, it's almost like in us somehow fairness outranks the generosity. And so we end up identifying with the grumbling workers that are hired first. That seems to be where we are. And if you think about it, those of you that when we looked at the parable of the prodigal son, those of you that, looked at the older son and said, he's got a point. Maybe this is another, visit to that same part of our heart. So what about it? Well, in general, the whole thing seems to point to the idea of that, okay, the kingdom's not fair. That's not the issue. That we might think it should be fair, or we might, if someone made us God, we'd make it fair. But maybe the overarching lesson of this whole thing is, no, the kingdom is not fair. But what specifically does that mean? Well, you could look at it this way. You could say, well, the kingdom is God's gift to us, and we shouldn't begrudge God's generosity. That's going back to the idea of using the allegory. You look at that and you say, okay, this guy's, it's not a question of fairness, it's a question of generosity, and that I should focus on God's gift. And the fact that God gives me a slightly different gift than someone else, that maybe Jesus is teaching me that I should be okay with that. There's also a lesson here theologically, what's it say about God, about a balance between God's justice and mercy. Because some of us, we tend to sort of hammer on God's justice. That's where we go first. Mercy second, justice is first. As we pointed out with the landowner, the landowner is just. And so maybe in the same way, God is just and merciful all at the same time. And I should point out, one of the things that makes all this uncomfortable sometimes is when you sort of, again, using the allegory, you go to the idea of the last judgment. And maybe a sort of an analogy comes up in your mind and you say, well, I have been a Christian, a disciple, been very faithful since I was a little kid. I never left the church and came back. I didn't do any of that kind of stuff. I've been faithful all this time. And you go to a funeral where they talk to you about, John, who, was basically lived this horrible life and came to faith, at the tender age of like 83 and died a year later. And maybe you're like, well, when I get to heaven, my mansion will be bigger, whatever that is. And then this comes up and you say, wait, is this telling me that this guy who lived like that, only had the 1 year, he's going to get the same reward as I am? Which may be a possible interpretation of this parable. I might add, if you think that way, it might be helpful to consider the idea of the length of life. when you look at the parable the way I was just suggested, you're assuming two people living at about the same length of life. But consider a teenager. Maybe he comes to faith at age of 16, 17, really takes it seriously, really starts living out his life, gets killed tragically a year later. Is that not sort of the same? At least similar to our guy John, who came to faith a year before he died, late in life? Both of them only served in the vineyard for a year. But yet, isn't it interesting when we think of the teenager, somehow the fairness issue doesn't seem to be quite the same. Maybe because we figure he didn't waste, all those years particularly, or he didn't have as many the older guy, the John, had a lot more chances. I don't know. But there again, I think there's something to potentially wrestle with us there. Something else this tells us about God is that God is giving us grace, not a reward. I know we talk about heaven as a reward, and maybe we need to be a little more careful about that. Because when we talk about rewards, then we just sort of naturally go to some might get better rewards than others because they did more than others. That's sort of a natural thing that sort of is embedded in the word reward. But if we were to focus on grace, something we know is given freely to all, if that's our focus, maybe we get away from the comparison and the envy that might come from that. Even as I'm saying this, I can just picture people going like, this is not comfortable. Because people have told me all my life that, there are big mansions and small mansions in heaven, or there are rungs in heaven, or time in purgatory is another way of looking at this. Like, oh, we all get to heaven and we're equal there, but I'll be scooting my way right through purgatory quicker than these other people. All of this, you are not the only one to struggle with this. You want to have a very interesting little exercise. Go to a search engine like Google and type in rewards in heaven sermons. Pardon me. You will come up with some really interesting stuff. I just clicked on like 3 links, and every one of them, at one point in the sermon, they talk about the fact, it's all about God's grace. He gives grace to us all, and he wants us all to go to heaven, and all those really nice topics. And at some other point in there, they suddenly sort of drop into reward mode, and we'll find some way to talk about rewards. And in fairness to them, you do at some point, as you wrestle with this, you got to deal with the parable of the talents. You remember that one? We'll get to it down the line, but the parable of the talents sure looks like everybody is getting rewarded differently based on their abilities. And that sort of puts some real tension in all of this. So in case I haven't been clear up to this point, I'm not arguing against rewards, but I do think that the parable is certainly, if nothing else, it's encouraging us not to think about that first. That it's got to be grace, mercy, that's first. Because clearly that just seems to be where God's heart would be. God doesn't strike me as, the first thing he's going to do is tally it all up and figure out who gets what. I think the first thing is it's God's grace. Let's all of us get to heaven. And then whatever God does with the rest of it, I guess we have to trust him for that. There's some applications here to the church, in the sense of, long-time parishioners versus people who just join. Some of you have lived through this. There's an old guard in a parish, something like that, maybe where you grew up or whatever, and they've been around. They've paid their dues. They put the money in to build the church, all that kind of stuff, and that's important. But I think if you fall yourself into that category, you need to be real careful that you're not a grumbling worker who got hired at dawn and are not willing to extend, hospitality, courtesy, all those things to people who just joined the church late. So we need to be careful in that sense about being the person who says, well, this is my ministry. I've been in charge of this ministry for 20 years. You just joined the church. I don't care what your background is, how much you did anywhere else. It's my ministry. You stay away from it. I think it's a pitfall. And fortunately, in my own priesthood, I've seen it rather rarely. Growing up, I saw it a lot. And so hopefully you haven't seen it much either. And hopefully it doesn't apply to you. It's an interesting application to this to beggars. This comes up a lot. People are forever trying to struggle with what do I do with beggars and, people on the street, homeless people, stuff like that. If you look at that situation from a vantage point of fairness, what's going to happen is you're going to say, I cannot be fair to every beggar in my town. I cannot be fair to every homeless person because I don't have the resources to do it. I can't give them all $5 every week. I just don't have that. And if you think that way, you are more likely than not going to decide, well, I'm not going to do anything for any of them because I can't be fair. But if on the other hand, if you approach that problem from the idea of mercy, grace, if you will, then in that case, you're not obligated to give every beggar $5 a week or something like that. You're just obligated to do what you can, I guess. A terrific example of this is a friend of mine who I don't know if she still does it, but she told me at one point in her life, every Sunday she put 5 $1 bills in her car. And as she would drive around over the course of the week, she would, as sort of the Spirit moved her, she would give that money away to people that she saw, begging at the side of the road. And at the end of the, as the week went on, eventually, of course, she'd run out of her 5 $1 bills. And at that point, she gave no more. Nor did she feel guilty about the fact that she was not doing anything. She had prayed about it and decided $5 a week was she kind of felt called to do that. And that was her mercy, if you will. And so she wasn't fair in any way to those people. But every person she gave $1 to or two, I'm sure was incredibly grateful. And finally, and I mean finally because you have been patient through this long video, the whole issue of fairness and comparisons. You'll never ask yourself the question of fairness unless you first compare your situation to someone else's. And so for me, one of the big overarching issues in this parable that applies to my life is fairness. Is comparison. I need constantly to remind myself that I should not compare my situation to somebody else's, especially when it comes to God. What God calls me to do in terms of ministry, in terms of giving, in terms of all sorts of things, that is what God has called me to do. That's got nothing to do with anybody else, and I shouldn't look at somebody else and say, oh, my word, they're only doing this, or they seem to have all these advantages which I don't. I need to leave that alone. I know, sadly, people in ministry who do. They compare ministerial assignments from where they were to where they are now. Priests and religious brothers and sisters who compare one assignment to the next, one living arrangement to the next. If you're working for someone, one boss to the next. I mean, just as an example, I certainly hope that Bishop Parks will be around for a long time, but I served a little bit under Bishop Lynch and now several years under Bishop Parks, and maybe I'll serve under another bishop. It does me no good at all to compare bishops. All bishops, no matter who they are, no matter what diocese, they all have their strengths, they all have their weaknesses. I don't do any good for myself or for them by doing a lot of comparisons. This is an important issue in my life. I don't know if it would be in yours. If it is, if you realize that I am constantly comparing myself, that even could be on social media. Everybody, what do they put up on social media? They put up the best look at their life possible. It's almost fiction in some respects. And so if you're sitting there comparing your life to what's on someone's Facebook page or social media page, this is not going to be good for you. And maybe at that point it's time to limit your access to that stuff. That's why we're looking at pictures, about fitness and things like that. It's probably not helpful to look at what appear on screen to be perfectly looking people. It's probably not going to be healthy for us. It's like, okay, well, this is the body the good Lord gave me and the athletic skill I gave me. There is a positive place for comparison in our lives, certainly as a tool to get better. We're going to compare maybe where we are to where we could be, something like that. But this parable to me is a big lesson in comparison, because I just remind myself, what happens if the landowner pays the workers in the order in which he hires them? So the first guys get their denarii, get the wage they expect, and they go home. And they're happy as a clam. They got a good day's work in, they got a good day's wage, that's it, everything's fine. But it's only when they saw the other guys get what they were not expecting that the comparison sets in, and then there's all the issue. That is a lot. According to the timer, 52 minutes worth of ideas and thoughts and detail about this parable. I hope you did pause it often. And if you did not, perhaps you'll consider going back and finding a section of it and just listening to a couple minutes and taking that to prayer. This is one of the reasons I wanted to do this parable, was I realized that, I don't know, maybe I'll find one that has got more stuff in it, but I just think there are more small issues that lend themselves to possible applications to our lives. And as you go through life, this is a parable you can come back to time and time and time again. Probably find new things, new applications. This is a great story. So thanks for staying with me. 43 minutes now, or 53 minutes now. Thanks for staying with me. I certainly hope God has blessed you through this. I know the good Lord blesses me as I study these, and I hope He's allowed me to be able to share some of that with you. So again, thanks for being with me, and may God bless you as you continue to be a disciple of Jesus.